Well, thank you, Roland, for being my guest on the WaveCapital guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 21st guest. I'm so glad for you to be here today. How are you?
I'm great, Garrett. Congratulations on that. That's a building portfolio.
Thank you, Roland. I'm reading your book, Michael Jordan, The Life. I'm really enjoying it a lot, and I can't wait to
Thank you.
talk to you about it, as well as all of the other books that you've written and how it's come to be in your life with relationship building, how it's led you here today. And Roland, when you think of relationship building, what does relationship building mean to Roland Lazenby?
Well, it's what it's come to me. Relationships for me have always just been so easy. Some people just have it that way, and some people are just lucky, and that is part of that. But as I've written these biographies, it's a close study of personality, not just personality, but I write about great competitive personalities. And, there are many of us that are competitive in many ways, but those in the arena, like a Michael Jordan or a Magic Johnson, whom I'm writing about now, they are unique. And I've been blessed over the years to consult with a number of excellent sports psychologists. One of those, George Mumford, has become a dear friend of mine, but he was deeply involved with the Bulls. Phil Jackson had pulled him in to try to take some of the pressure off of Michael and his teammates. And that's where I met George, covering the Bulls back in the 90s. George and I stayed at the same facility beside the Bulls practice facility. But George really got me to thinking in terms of emotional intelligence and how vital that was. And, it comes in so many facets, but these great competitors are they're self-made in some ways. They are quite organic, although there are obviously contrived things about anything like a professional sports league like the NBA. There are certain things about these figures that are truly organic, and it's fun just to explore who they are and how they came to be that way.
Absolutely. And you have to really pull in a lot of your resources, talking to, various people, various experts who are closely tied to the organization or were at one time. And you speak of George Mumford, how he became a friend of yours. Whom else did you have to speak with? And how long did it take you to realize, hey, I have the ability to write about Michael Jordan or write about Magic Johnson? Were you always a book author? Tell me more about relationships as well, early on in your career. But, I'd love to just know, like, how much of the direct access you had with these athletes, or were you from afar gathering all the information through various parties who are close to them?
Oh, no, I wrote several books about the Bulls that were official books. And I actually, I'd done that. I had first written a book about Ralph Sampson. I was a newspaper reporter. And before that, I was a high school wrestling coach. I had no thought that I would ever be a sports writer. It was not something in my mind. I was not a great student. I did end up with a undergraduate degree from Virginia Military Institute, but that was a long, sad story. It took forever. But I was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm when I was a 24-year-old varsity head coach. And at the end of my first season, I was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm and hospitalized for 10 days. And I had late in college, I dabbled in writing a little bit, and I'd sort of realized, hey, I like this. And I spent 10 days in the hospital. Back then, they didn't have the technology to diagnose it properly. I was in great shape. I was pretty much what you call a physical specimen. I'm the antithesis of that today as an old man, but back then I was the company pull-up champion at VMI. I played a year of college football, 3 years of rugby, and now was the wrestling coach and wrestled. We had a really good team, and I wrestled my heavyweights every day. But here I was in the hospital, scared to death. The doctor told me it looked like I was about to have my first bleed on my aneurysm, and that there was a 30% mortality rate on the first bleed. And of course, that led to some soul searching. He said, you better get your affairs in order. And he came back to me about 7 days later and said, we've given you every test possible. You haven't had your first bleed. And we have one more test we can give you, but if we do, it might induce a stroke. So we are going to discharge you. And my wife drove to pick me up, and we had both just sort of we had a young daughter, the start of our family, and we both had been blindsided by it. And I said, and I was in great shape. And I said, when we got home, I said, I'm going to run 5 miles. I got to find out. I can't let this hang over my head. And so I went and ran 5 miles, and everything was okay. And in the aftermath of that, I got the idea I wanted to be a writer. And after another year of coaching wrestling, I got hired, and I'd been doing some freelancing for the local weekly in Blacksburg. And I got hired to cover Virginia Tech football and to be the full-time sports editor of the paper. I left behind my teaching and coaching job. And boy, I was on a mission. I mean, 80, 90-hour weeks. I wanted to move through the industry, and I did. I got a master's in a writing program at Hollins University here in Roanoke, Virginia. Really fine writing school. And from there, I did my first book while I was there. And doing that book on Ralph Sampson, I met Billy Packer of CBS Sports. He was the top dog among broadcasters. We ended up doing 5 books together over the years. Billy's a great friend. And I went on from there. We did a book that sold really well for a publisher, and they told me, what did I want to do? And at the time, they were doing these hardcover guides to the Dallas Cowboys that were selling well. I said, well, I'd like to do that for the Boston Celtics. And like that, I was sitting on press row in Boston. The Celtics loved the idea. And the next thing you know, the publishers said, well, call the Pistons and then the Lakers. And suddenly I had all the NBA teams, and my career was idea driven. I realized there was no history of the NBA finals. So I proposed to the publisher, we do a history of the NBA finals. The NBA loved it. And so
that's great.
Next thing I know, I'm getting to interview all the greats, all the old timers, and really settled into that. Then I looked around a year later. I said, Billy, the Hall of Fame's getting ready to have a 100-year history. This was 1991. And I mentioned this to him in, late 89 or so. And so we put together, Billy and I, a book called The Golden Game about the entire history of basketball. And so these projects, Billy and I had also done a history of the Final Four. So these projects ended up being like graduate level work, except that I got to interview everybody, and I got to, just the right kind of exposure. So it was great fun, a tremendous opportunity. And from there, I wanted to move even deeper into trade publishing. Trade publishing means the books that go into bookstores. And I just was an idea guy. Publishing is idea driven. And, Michael Jordan told me once, sitting down in the cheap seats in Orlando for the pre-draft camp in '08, I was asking him about his career. And he said something profound to me. He said, timing's everything. And of course, Michael had this incredible timing to his career, unmatched. He came along at just the perfect time to be the godhead of global sports marketing, as I called him in Michael Jordan, the Life. Well, I had my own good timing. I came in and started writing about the NBA. There wasn't the big crowd. Very soon, the digital world would take over. But I came in the last analog days. And I was trudging around. I was nobody important, but I didn't know that. I was trudging around interviewing everybody. I was happy. They have a saying here in the hills of Virginia where I live. I was happy as a pig in slop, and really had a great time interviewing and getting to know people. And of course, I worked with the Celtics and the Pistons. I got to cover, and I had first covered Jordan writing about Ralph Sampson. And just to see those games with Ralph being the National Player of the Year and Jordan charging on, it was, I saw amazing things. And then I was traveling and covering the Pistons. And I got to know Joe Dumars really well, and Isaiah was great. And I got to know Dennis Rodman and all of those guys. And I was there, I was doing books for both teams, and there were the Pistons and the Celtics in these monumental showdowns. And then once the Pistons break out, then it was just epic, the showdowns with Jordan and his Bulls, and so this whole thing, and then suddenly I'm at the 92 All-Star game. I got a contract to write a full-scale book on the Lakers. And I'm
in Orlando,
there.
The 92 All-Star game.
Oh, yeah. It was a bad recession. And I was doing about 100,000 in writing work a year. And that triple dip recession hit there. So I go to Orlando. I have my press credential, but I drive down in my car. My contracts are delayed. I don't have the revenue. So I sleep in my car in the media hotel parking lot, but I'm able to go in. I've got my credential. I'm able to go to all the activities. And so I just sleep in the car and cover the thing. And, you can get on the media bus. You got all the free media, food and drink. So it was fine. But that's where the Chicago Tribune had a book division back then. And they hired me to write the history of the Bulls. And I went in the summer '93. Jordan hadn't announced he was leaving the Bulls yet.
Right.
But I happened in very quickly behind the scenes in my interviews to this death match between Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson. And I was right in the middle of it because it came down to my interviews with both men. And Phil was poking the bear in his interviews and doing things that just infuriated Krause. They had been close and worked together, and they had become basically what would end up being enemies. But the history did extremely well. I got hired to do 2 more. Actually, I did 3 Bulls championship books. The nice books when you win a championship. And one of them was named the Independent Publishing Association Sports Book of the Year that was for the 96 season when they were 72-10. But then one of the publishers hired me to write a full-length book on that last season called The Last Dance. My book was called Blood on the Horns. And it became a USA Today #1 bestseller because I had gotten to know everybody pretty well. And I was especially close with Tex Winter, the Triangle coach, Phil Jackson's assistant. Phil Jackson gave me lots of time. I had worked around to where I could get one-on-ones with Michael. And,
that's amazing access to be friends with Tex Winter. That's great.
Yeah, it was anyway, that's a long version of it, but that pretty much says how I rolled out of the hills, a Virginia hillbilly, and ended up having a delightful time.
Well, you had all of these relationships. You had all these
Right.
relationships, and this is what this podcast is about: relationship building in a team environment. And you talk about Ralph Sampson, and I worked with his daughter Rachel Sampson at ESPN. Have had the pleasure of meeting Michael Jordan, and you see his picture above my shoulder. You talk about all of these players you got to cover, and getting to know Michael on a one-to-one basis, and having the access to interview him. Any surprises, any things that when you were writing this book, you're like, I can't believe I'm writing this. I mean, look at all this content that I'm putting out and disseminating. And how did you get the clearance to cover and have some of the content be disseminated out to the public? Because some of these anecdotes in the book that I'm reading seem very personal to Michael and his family.
Right, they are. And but the first book, Blood on the Horns, and I've been writing. I wrote a full-length book on the Lakers. I'd been doing a good bit of this stuff, and as I went along, virtually everything I did was a surprise. I'm interviewing Phil Jackson at one point during the Last Dance season. And Phil is by then in an all-out war with Jerry Krause. They hate each other. And I'm just in there to talk to him about the situation because it was unusual. And he starts telling me in the interview about the last thing Jordan liked to do before he played a game was go back and sit on the john. And that Jerry Krause just would not let the team alone. General managers usually stay away from the team because it's a lot of pressure on the players, but Krause was everywhere. And Phil said, yeah, Jerry had this need for intimacy. It seemed like every time Michael was back there on the john, Jerry would choose that moment to go back and sit on the john. And Phil was telling me all this stuff because he knew he was jabbing it to Krause. And everybody sort of unloaded on their personal experiences for Blood on the Horns. And it was a book that I had to do in a pretty big hurry, but it was full of, everybody from Tex Winter on down the line, they were explaining how they felt about things. And it really got into Jordan's brutally harsh leadership style. And that's why the Chicago Sun-Times bought the excerpts to the book. They on their news boxes back then, they had Blood on the Horns on each news box all over the city. And that book sold a lot of copies in hardcover. And they ran on front page excerpts for like 10 days. It was ridiculous, but everybody just sort of unloaded as that was coming to an end. And, I went on to do other projects, but about 2008, I got hired by ESPN Books to write a biography of Jerry West. And I had done a biography of Phil Jackson earlier, but this moved me into, it moved me into writing large biography where you examine everything. Right. And the Jerry West book got me hired to do the Michael Jordan biography. And this is all based on proposal work. And, my proposal for the Jordan book was called The Pig. Tim Hallam, the Bulls PR director, always called the crowd of media around Jordan the pig, because it was a lot of, sports writers. They tend to run overweight. They all got cameras and microphones. This was in the 90s. But, I began talking about the experience of being in the pig in that media crowd covering Jordan. And that was the intro to the thing. But the fact was that the media people, Michael would dress in these wonderful suits and come out afterward, and they would say, why don't you get to the podium? But he liked being there in the pig. And it was that intimacy. And it was really I think, essential to Jordan because he was so charismatic. And those reporters would crowd in around him with their questions, and it was ridiculous. You still see a lot of that. You catch it there, but in those days, those crowds around Jordan were spectacular.
I'm sure it was like very legendary. I mean, even Marv Albert said, it feels like the Beatles are
Oh, yeah. And when Jordan
descending
came
on the
back,
court.
when Jordan came back in March of 95, I was there covering every bit of that. I was teaching college 2 days a week and then spending every weekend, 4-day weekend in Chicago. I mean, I couldn't, it was just too great. Every event. And that led into 96 season, 97, 98. And I was there covering all of them.
Were you amazed that a GM like the late Jerry Krause, that a GM had so much power? Because Jerry Reinsdorf was the owner. And typically, if the owner doesn't like something, yes, he is going to, or she is going to, or the group is going to talk to the GM. The GM has to talk to the coach, and the coach has to talk to the players. But why do you think that Jerry Reinsdorf gave so much power to Jerry Krause? Because it seemed to me that if Jerry Krause was in the picture, although he helped tremendously, he helped put that team together. And obviously, you saw the switch between Doug Collins and Phil Jackson taking over, and seemed like they had a more harmonious relationship. But going back to my previous question, how did Jerry Krause get so much latitude and free reign from Jerry Reinsdorf, in your opinion?
Well, Jerry Krause was a joke in Chicago. He had earlier been named the GM of the Bulls in the late 70s, and it lasted a month. And Jerry was a complicated guy, extremely talented. It seemed to me, and I spent a lot of time with Jerry. I did lots of interviews with him. And I found an interview tape. We've been going through all my tapes for a big project from over the years. I've saved all these cassette tapes, but a lot of them I hadn't listened to because you're in such a rush. And Jerry Krause, I was at a game in Chicago. The Lakers were in town to play the old Washington Bullets. And I drove there to cover the game, and it's a pretty good game, and the Lakers are always drawing a big media crowd. And I'm going into the locker room to do my interviews, and I look up. This is April of '91, and there's Jerry Krause, and he's just standing outside the locker room, and it was obvious he was hoping somebody would talk to him. And so I pop over there and start chatting with him, and I didn't understand at the time why I was there, but he had done a brilliant job working for the Lakers in the late 70s as a scout. He had also done that for the Bullets earlier. He was very close to those two franchises. And that spring, the Bulls were coming alive, and he knew he had a great team. And so he wanted, it wasn't gloating, it was gloating, but he wanted to come down and sort of bask in all the spotlight that he thought would be there. And as it turned out, I was the only spotlight. I was the guy there interviewing him. And just listening to that recording this year for the first time in 30 years, he was so hopeful, so excited, so proud of everything he had fought back in his hometown after being laughed out of town, and he had come back, and he was empowered by Jerry Reinsdorf, and he had a lot of the abilities to do the job well. And then I contrasted that, with all the interviews I did with Jerry before he died. After all this came apart in a very unhappy fashion. He was a bitter guy. And he told me, I have all the videotape of all the moments, every game of the Jordan career. I've never looked at one of them, not for a second.
Mhm.
And when I was contrasting 91 to, I just thought how sad the whole thing was, because Jerry really did have the vision. Nobody wanted to hire Phil Jackson. Nobody wanted to hire Tex Winter. But Jerry was his own worst enemy. And just like the earlier anecdote, he was always had high needs for attention and recognition. And, you know, these teams ultimately often become a battle over who gets the credit for what.
And that's the opposite of relationship building. You would think that here are the Chicago Bulls dynasty, 6 championships in 8 years. And a lot of relationship building had to happen in the 80s. You know, Michael really liked Doug Collins because he always kept the ball in his hands. Then Phil Jackson comes in and he's preaching more of a Dean Smith type of game plan, which Michael was accustomed to at North Carolina. But the reason why Michael had to grow, and he went through a lot of growing pains, because he didn't have Scottie Pippen yet. And his supporting cast, although they're professional NBA players, you're having to face the Lakers dynasty. You're having to face the Celtics dynasty. You're having to face the bad boy Pistons, even teams like Cleveland or the Portland Trailblazers. I mean, there were great NBA teams in the 80s. I think that, you know, if Michael had Scottie Pippen and some of those other players in the 90s, maybe he would have had much earlier championship success, but then who knows how long it was going to sustain the 90s. So you're right. It was tailor-made. He came in at a phenomenal time.
It took 7 years, and it was a painful 7 years. But to answer your question, I have long, complicated answers sometimes. Why did Jerry Reinsdorf have Jerry Krause and allow him to do what he did? I think that's really the heart of The Last Dance docuseries. It didn't make it clear. But Jerry Krause was a first-class son of a, and he didn't give a crap about anybody, in the sense that he was tough and he was going to tell Phil Jackson, I don't care if you got 3 championships, you're not worth the money. And he would fight that battle for Reinsdorf. And Reinsdorf didn't have to do it, but Reinsdorf had hugely pissed off Jordan about, because Jordan had come back and played for virtually nothing. And then Reinsdorf just could not be magnanimous about any of this. And Reinsdorf was a good guy, but he just didn't have the personal skills to be, and he and his partners made an absolute killing. They bought the Bulls for like $10 million in 84, 85, and watched it, you know, it's worth how many billion today. But even in the 90s, Michael took the value of that franchise and made them, you know, it was easily you wouldn't have sold it for $1 billion. And Reinsdorf had made all this money, and yet he did not want to give any of those guys raises, and he really resented giving Michael the money. And Krause was the guy who sort of provided cover for Jerry Reinsdorf in that regard.
So you're saying from your perspective, from your experience, they thought one and the same in some ways?
I think yeah, somewhat. Krause was a kingmaker. He really did find people, talented people. He did all kinds of things. He was a kingmaker. He understood all kinds of talent, but he resented when he took people from being relative nobodies to somebodies. He resented suddenly that they would be making more than he was. And he resented, you know, he was the backup catcher on the baseball team, the guy who would never get in the game, but they would let him catch warm up before the game, you know, and he had suffered, you could just look at him and see the short, fat guy who had suffered the ridicule all these years. And there was a lot of that in all of this. And he's dealing with premier jocks, and he just didn't understand who Jordan was. Nobody did. But Krause would go in and poke the bear with Jordan, about all kinds of things. All kinds of things. You didn't have to do much to infuriate Michael and really ignite that competitive anger in him. And Krause would go on. Krause had really scouted Earl the Pearl. Krause, he was one of the first guys to be in the traditionally Black colleges and universities scouting talent.
Earl the Pearl Monroe from the New York Knicks.
And he would go on about Earl Monroe, and Jordan could have choked him. And, he got in the middle of Jordan's broken foot, and he was doing Reinsdorf's bidding there. Those were complicated things. You can't mess with a competitive personality like that.
I remember from The Last Dance how Michael was having a conversation with Reinsdorf and so eager to get back into playing in 1986 when he's broke his foot. And it just showed how exceptional, and in my opinion, widely, Michael Jordan is considered the greatest basketball player of all time. I mean, how many athletes even today can you think of who comes back from breaking his foot, and then with a few games, he dropped 63 points on the Boston Celtics, and they only lost that game by 4, 135 to 131. And, Michael still 63 points is a playoff record to this day. And that was playing against.
The Celtics wouldn't even double team him. Casey Jones, the old style, he didn't want to double team him. They just let it. They said, they're not going to beat us. And he let him go. And they were saying, Coach, don't you want to double team now? But he wouldn't even double team him. But I have to say this about that. That's the romantic version. And Last Dance, it's a romantic thing. He's a sports hero. He wants to play on a broken foot. Reinsdorf is trying to teach him the principle of risk reward. Yeah, you're going to risk your career to play these last few games. What's the reward for that? What are you going to get out of it? You're going to get paid no matter what. Why are you? And Reinsdorf is the picture of cold reason. And Jordan is the picture of impassioned fury. And so there are certain places they could meet and understand one another. But in so many ways, and Krause was doing Reinsdorf's bidding on all this. And of course, Krause agreed with him, risk reward. We all should learn early in life in our decision-making, the balance of risk reward. Boy, I think the gambling parlors would be out of business if everybody calculated risk reward. You got all these people going all in, wagering 10 times what a pot is, just gambling. And so Jordan was a gambler. He wanted to get back at it. And he'd been down playing in Chapel Hill. He knew he could play. And so it just was one of those things.
Do you feel that the dynasty could have continued at least a year or two more if, for the purpose of this podcast, relationship building was at its best? They had all the pieces.
When I wanted the time with Jordan, and I got time with him several situations, one-on-one. And one of the first sessions I did, this thing was grinding to its disaster. And I said, Michael, can't we get everybody in a room and work this out? Can't we just get everybody to sit down and say, okay, let's negotiate this and get out all the silliness and not in this dynasty? Because they were good. They executed that triangle offense, which has been outlawed, by the way. You can't play it anymore in the NBA. But I said, Michael, can't we just get together and square this thing up? This is silly. He said, there's no way. He said, if you expect me, having done all the things I've done to have my career, if you expect me to sit down and talk with him after all the dumb stuff he's done to derail what we're trying to do, and the attitude he's taken, I'm not sitting down and talking with him. And he told me that. And I really think that if I had taken that same question to Krause, he'd have said the same thing. He hated Michael by then. And, you know, in Michael Jordan retirement night, the first time I was up there, was, you know, televised on TBS, was 94. Dean Smith was there. Michael, they were showing the statue they'd put up, and they booed Krause when he was in. The whole crowd booed the crap out of him. And his wife Thelma was sitting there, and she was in tears. And Dean Smith went up to comfort her, and she said, "Get away! You know, I don't want you around. Yeah, you know, you helped create all this. You know, this is Michael. You know, this is this bad." And the bitterness was there before Michael ever came back for that next one. And it was what killed it all.
How much of a strong relationship did Phil Jackson have with Michael Jordan? Obviously, he coached Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant for their three-peat with the Lakers. And, you know, in the NBA, one decision leads to another. If the Bulls don't get broken up, Phil Jackson doesn't go to LA the next year and then win those 3 titles, and obviously wins 2 more with just Kobe Bryant and that supporting cast for those 2 years. But how much of an influence did Phil Jackson have on Michael Jordan's development, especially when he took over as a head coach? And how quickly maybe did Michael realize, once the Doug Collins tenure was through, that Phil was probably the right guy for the job, you know,
That was
going
a
into the
process.
90s?
Tex Winter said that, of course, Phil Jackson's main talent, as Tex spent lots of time with me, not just in that era. Tex and I would have long phone conversations. And Phil Jackson's main talent was relationship building. And, you know, Phil was a guy who believed in a decided hierarchy. That's why Shaq and Kobe was such a conflict in Los Angeles, because Kobe was young and had all this ambition. I was right in the middle of that too. And Phil sided with Shaquille. That was the top of his hierarchy. And Chicago was easier. Michael Jordan was the top of the hierarchy from the start, and everybody else had to fall in line behind that. And that's really how basketball teams work. If they're coached well, they're built on a hierarchy. Everybody knows how things are going to be. And that was Phil's strength. But Phil also was a great manipulator. And as George Mumford pointed out to me, manipulation leads to alienation. And one of the terrible things in the Bulls was Johnny Bach, the assistant coach. They had 2 elderly assistant coaches, Tex Winter and Johnny Bach. And Johnny Bach was a great figure. And, you know, he would get in Jordan's ear and say, attack, attack, attack. And Phil was trying to work that triangle. And Phil was, and this was according to Reinsdorf and Krause, who told me this. And Sam Smith disputes this some, but when I called him about it at the time, he quibbled about it. But Sam Smith had some inside sources for his fabulous book, The Jordan Rules, about, you know, the 91 season.
I have that book right on my shelf.
Right. Well, Phil Jackson told everybody he wanted to get rid. He didn't tell everybody that Phil wanted to get rid of Johnny Bach. He did not want any conflicting voices there. And Johnny Bach, the beloved assistant coach, but Phil let Krause believe that Johnny Bach had provided much of the inside secretive detail for the Jordan Rules. And the one thing that Jerry Krause and Michael Jordan could agree on is that they absolutely hated the Jordan Rules. And Krause told me, Sam Smith made some money on that book. I hope he chokes on every dollar. That's the passion they had over their anger. And so Jackson led Krause to believe that Johnny Bach had provided it. Johnny Bach hadn't provided any of it. And as the Last Dance season came to a close, that's when Krause and Reinsdorf spilled this whole story out to me in their anger. And I actually got it in the Phil Jackson biography. But Phil, because he had got Jerry Krause enraged at Johnny Bach, he then had permission to fire Bach. And Johnny Bach had, it devastated his life. He didn't understand why he was being fired. He had a heart attack. He went through all this stuff. This is a long answer to your question. And so later, Krause, when he found out what Phil had done, he had this tearful reunion with Bach, who was coaching with Doug Collins in Detroit. He apologized for everything that happened. And of course, Bach later went to Charlotte to coach. He was a veteran assistant coach, great guy, just an incredible figure. And and going back to the idea that manipulation leads to alienation, when Michael Jordan was inducted into the Hall of Fame, he bought Johnny Bach a new suit of clothes, and he put him on his personal jet to go and experience the whole thing with him. And Phil Jackson, meanwhile, got to watch it from a sports bar. And I think that there are all these kinds of conflicts. And before I published the story about Johnny Bach, now this is typical Phil. I packaged up my manuscript and I FedExed it to Phil Jackson so that he'd have a couple of months to go over it. It laid out the whole Johnny Bach story. I never heard a word from Phil about it. He didn't respond. So 20 years later, this was in 1999 in the fall, as he was getting ready to go to work at the Lakers. Now, Phil later came after me for reporting this. Phil was pretty vicious about it. But 20 years later, he answered me with an email. He sent me an email in 2019 about it. But even crazier, and Tex Winter was explaining to me all that Phil was doing to come after me. And by the time he was with the Lakers, I've been working with the Lakers for years, but they began to limit my press access to the Lakers. And they would tell Tex, quit talking to that guy. Tex said, hell no, he's just saying what happens. He's there to represent the facts. And Tex stood up to me fiercely, and Tex would do interviews with me all day long. He was incredible. It would never been the truth at all. But when Phil did his autobiography, 11 Rings, I was stunned that they twice cited my unauthorized biography in the notes for that book. And that's the way Phil is. He'll do subtle mind games. In fact, my book about Phil was called Mind Games. Phil would do subtle things like that as a way of acknowledging that, he had probably been overboard and way unfair in how he responded. And so these are complicated people. They do build relationships, and often they build very complicated relationships, but they are bound together by the challenge. They are bound together by the life. I call whatever you're doing, these insular worlds, whether it's the stock market or the NBA, I call them the tube. You're so in the tube that is your world. It's like your whole atmosphere, and everything else going on around you doesn't matter. You're competing in the tube. And so these personalities who are in the tube, it's almost like they aren't everyday people.
Because they're so much caught up in what's going on in the immediate and the now. They're
Especially with those Jordan teams it was incredible. That was really a lot of what drove the global interest. Now, David Stern had begun dumping NBA games in the early 80s when he was moved in as commissioner all over Europe. In Romania, and I learned this as I went along, in Romania, they love soccer, but they couldn't afford to produce their local soccer games. But they could have NBA games on TV because they were so cheap to air. They weren't being charged much. But the payoff on that, the NBA built this global fan base. And suddenly t-shirt sales, equipment sales, all that stuff went from 100 million up over into the billions. And that started with Larry Magic. As Michael came in, it just blew up. And today we see that was all David Stern's marketing strategy, and it proved brilliant.
Do you still keep in touch with Michael and Phil and other former players?
Not much. The way you do that, if you're a writer, you're out on the circuit. Once I started writing biographies, but I went down, I had to tell Michael personally I was doing a biography on him. And nobody likes a biography. Steve Kerr's a great guy. Scott Howard Cooper, my friend, a great NBA writer, did a biography on Steve. Scott was telling me Steve won't speak to him anymore. And these are difficult things. Some of the hard stories in the Jordan book. And, I never use those stories to sell the book. I don't talk about them unless people bring it up. But Michael has an older sister who's a grandmother today. And from the time she was a teen, she had made allegations against her father. And nobody but the Jordan parents and this girl knew these allegations. But when James Jordan was murdered in the aftermath of that, the sister privately published a book that laid out everything about the dynamic of the family. And, when you're doing a biography, and I'm doing one on Magic Johnson now, the idea is you're going to play it straight up. If it's part of the public record, if you have the information, then you're there to explain things. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I was miserable about this. And it went on. And I went down to UNC, to the library there, and I was doing research. And there in special collections was Michael's sister's book. And I said, the library at UNC has it on special collections. I can't avoid, and not only that, it explains so much of the dynamic in the Jordan family. And all of these things, the overwhelming thing, I think, for my biography is that all of these things Jordan did in basketball, he did despite this backstory that no one knew of the immense difficulty and conflict in his family and how difficult that was for Michael. And so when I wrote about the sister's allegations, and you've probably read that part, you don't see it coming anywhere in the book. I do not hype it. It's not blown up as some big deal. I deal with it in a very short section. It's very matter of fact. Statute of limitations ran out on it long ago. I said, there's no way you can know if it's true or not. But the mere allegations themselves are devastating to families. And I did not do any more. I was a police reporter before I ever became a sports writer. And so I covered court cases, and I just wrote a little bit about that. Now, Michael shook my hand after the book came out, but he remains very angry about that, just as he was furious about his sister's book. And, I don't have an answer for that. Was it the right thing? Was it the wrong thing? I felt as a biographer, that was a significant document. I read the book. I found it believable. Not that he did that, but that she believed he did it, that there was serious he said, she said about it. And it wasn't one incident. It was a pattern of abuse, she alleged. And she didn't allege it just as a teenager. She alleged it over the entire course of her life. And she loved her father very much. And my book, you'll see it ends with James Jordan and Michael together in this segment. I won't tell you anymore. But and James Jordan was beloved in Chicago, but he had issues, and they involved legal issues on important things. And the book detailed his issues, and it's very sad. I don't have an answer for it. It was among pertinent, obvious public facts. I did not hype them, but I did include them. As far as team building goes, I had to sit down in 1998. I had all this information behind the scenes about how brutal and harsh Michael Jordan was with his teammates, how brutal and harsh he was with Jerry Krause on the team bus, and how he would treat people. And I had to figure, how am I going to ask Michael this face to face? And I decided, Michael is a great team leader. And I'm going to say, Michael, and James Worthy had told me, Michael is a bully, and he bullied me. I was a junior at UNC. He was a freshman. He bullied me. And so I had to sit down and say, Michael, some people say you have an extremely wicked sense of humor, that you're very harsh on your teammates, but that is your leadership style, that you are a great team leader, and that's what you do. And that was how I couched it to him, so that we could have that conversation. And his answer to me was, it is true. I can be very hard, but I don't treat them badly just for the purpose of treating them badly. I put all kinds of pressure on them because I want to find out if they can handle the pressure, because I need people to be able to handle the pressure when they're on the floor with me at championship time. Now, Michael believed that, I'm sure, in his mind. Others scoffed at that as the reason, and that there was a certain part of Michael that was just really, really harsh. But I had to ask him to his face before I published those things.
And what has all of this, if you can think of it, as a culmination of your career as a book author, what has it taught you about relationship building in your life as you think about and chronicle your personal life, and even leading to wanting to write another book about another NBA superstar like Magic Johnson, who went through his trials and tribulations? But I wanted to spend the last several minutes of talking about you personally, and what has relationship building meant to you? And was your impression of relationship building different before you were writing all these books and covering these athletes? Did it add to it? Did your idea of relationship building adapt in any way?
My obviously, you can't be a biographer really spending all your time poring over the details of human nature without being changed by that. My natural inclination has always been an open and easygoing, friendly manner that led to every kind of relationship building. I went to college at Virginia Military Institute, where the class system, is built under all this duress they throw at you. March into class 6 days a week, and all of the inspections, and and so I had that natural ability to do that. It didn't make me a great leader, but it made me a good friend. But I also have coached a lot, and I've had some success coaching. And I guess it's also organic in my life, especially going through a leadership place like Virginia Military Institute, where that's the whole focus. And um, being involved in all the sports teams, and so much of it is by example. So much of leadership, and this is particularly true in sports, are you going to be that person that can step up? Do you have that certain element of fearlessness that allows you to step into a moment? But I think that's also true in everyday life. And I think example, nobody worked harder than Michael Jordan, except maybe Kobe Bryant. And Kobe Bryant had terrible leadership skills, except that he was insane in his work ethic. And he struggled to be a leader. Magic Johnson, people would follow him through walls. They're all different. Everybody has a very individual leadership style based on family and personality. But I think one of the big common things, two of them, one, do you have a style? What is it? And two, what is your level of emotional intelligence? And I think it is probably the least respected of the quote sets of intelligence. But I disagree with that. I think emotional intelligence is one of the most powerful forces in humanity.
I believe so too, the emotional intelligence quotient.
And it is huge in getting people to respond. The example you set and your level of emotional intelligence, how in tune you are. It doesn't mean you're always empathetic. Jordan was hardly ever empathetic, but he was in tune. He knew what he could do to punch the buttons of the people around him. And he was ruthless in punching those buttons. He was playing Jim Rose, an African-American broadcaster in Chicago for Blood on the Horns, the book about the Last Dance season. He was playing in a charity game, 2-on-2 with Jordan at some event, fundraising event, and he blew a layup. And Jordan looked at him and said, "You're not black enough." Jim Rose said, "I was so furious, I found myself throwing the ball at Michael's head, trying to take his head off." And, Jim's this extremely bright, successful broadcaster, just a really, really good person. And Jordan reached right in and took him to that other level. Of course, Jordan was used to doing that himself. Everyone knows that when Michael needed to motivate himself, if he didn't have something, he could make something up that just reach right in the chest and punch that button over the heart that elevated everything.
Yeah. And, when my father and I met Michael back in 2005, and again, this is my basketball idol, and I consider him to be, just like many millions of people across the world, the greatest basketball player of all time. And obviously, there's the personal side of Michael and there's a professional side. And, as a 17-year-old, even to this day, I still think about everything he'd done for the game of basketball, because nobody in life is perfect, and, nobody's upbringing is perfect. But I think that, you always want to see the positives in everybody, because nobody's perfect. And, I was just drawn to just his way that he carried himself. And even Allen Iverson alluded to it, that when he first saw Michael Jordan on the court, he felt like there was an aura around him, and Allen Iverson, mentioned it in his Hall of Fame speech too. But when my dad,
there was an aura around him, by the way.
There, of course, there really was. And I remember what it felt like when I first saw him in person for the first time. And as a 17-year-old thinking, wow, did I ever think that I'd have the opportunity to meet him? And my father made that possible by, bringing me along with him to the Hoop T Celebrity Golf Classic. but my short anecdote, and it's something that will live on with me forever, is that my dad walked up to him with me and he said, Michael, this is forever. They call him MJ in high school. He's on the high school basketball team. His nickname is MJ because he has so much admiration for you. And Michael's antennas were up and he looked at me and he said, well, you got to grow a little bit, don't you, boy? To be called MJ.
But he had the ability to poke in a funny way. I've seen him do it 100 times. And he just had, Sonny Vaccaro was the one who drove Nike to give him that fabulous contract right out of college. And Sonny Vaccaro saw him against Georgetown in the championship game as a freshman. And he said, this kid has got the it factor unlike anybody else. And of course, Sonny later decided the same about Kobe. They have a certain charisma. It doesn't mean they're the nicest. It doesn't mean they're this or that. It's almost that thing that can't be defined, that ability.
On that note, when you talk about the complications of human beings, especially at that level, the greatness that they have, the personality traits, what makes them who they are and what makes them, whether they're great relationship builders or not. The last question to you is before we conclude. And again, I just want to preface this by saying I look forward to having many more conversations with you. I know that you're currently writing your book about Magic Johnson's life. I'd love to interview you in the future because this is clearly not enough time, even though we've talked for over an hour and I've enjoyed every minute of it. And I can't wait to have many more conversations with you. And I want to write a book, as I've mentioned to you, and you're one of the chapters in my book because you're one of my guests of the podcast. But what final words do you have for our audience here today about relationship building, and what words of wisdom can you impart that they can carry from this episode?
There's so many different relationships. It's hard almost, there are sales relationships where you have to accomplish things in a very quick amount of time. There are other relationships that require a slow process. I think it's all wrapped up in the secret of emotional intelligence. And it's almost, I write all my biographies as if I'm pursuing a mystery. And there is a great mystery in every life. And there's a great mystery to every relationship. And you really sort of unpack the details at the time. I remember the first time I saw Michael, I was covering a University of Virginia game against North Carolina at U-Hall, the old U-Hall in Charlottesville. The Wahoos had something like a 30-game win streak, and UNC got a big lead on them. This was in January of '83, as I recall. And suddenly UVA came storming back. They had Ralph, they had Othell Wilson, and they were coming back, and they had cut the lead to about 4. And Ralph Sampson, all 7'4" of him, came down the floor, got a good open jumper, and Jordan leapt diagonally across the lane. The most amazing play. I mean, I've seen millions of basketball plays. He leapt across that lane. He slammed Jordan's jumper down with the ferocity that made everybody on press row jump. He just scared the crap out of everybody. It was such a ferocious play. I'd never seen anything like it. It was a defensive. And so 15 years later, I'm sitting in the Charlotte Coliseum, the nice new building they tore down in Charlotte. But I'm sitting there, the Bulls are getting ready to play a game, and Michael is sipping coffee out of a styrofoam cup, and I'm getting to talk with him one-on-one. I said, Michael, do you remember blocking that shot against Ralph Sampson? He looked at me, he said, remember it? He said, I had no idea I could do that. He said, the thing that people don't understand is that I was surprising even myself with the things I did. And so, and Michael wanted to go to UVA instead of UNC. And he wrote Terry Holland. Terry confirmed this for the book. You'll read it later if you're reading the book. Terry wouldn't recruit him. he was sure Dean Smith wouldn't let him go. And so he declined to recruit Michael Jordan. And I think part of the ferocity of that block, Terry Holland was over there applauding the block. It was such an amazing play. Terry Holland said, then I realized I was applauding against my own team, and I grabbed the ref. I said, that's goaltending. That's goaltending. But the relationships are obviously built differently all over the place. I think Michael has provided us probably with some of the most unique relationship building in the history of competitive sports.
I would agree with that. And I would love to talk about this with you as well and chronicle it in the book. So if I have follow-up questions after this podcast, when I start writing the book, I'll be sure to ask you, because that would complete the chapter with, you and me as my guest on the WaveCapital guest speaker series on relationship building and team environment. Thank you so much, Roland, for all of this exciting insight, very riveting, very in-depth. And it just speaks to the level of access that you had and people trusting you to chronicle this information in the way that you have. And I know that it sure wasn't easy getting these books written and knowing what to put and not to put and being respectful, I'm sure, of other people's personal lives.
I have my guidelines. There are plenty of things, including Michael's book, that I did not include. I might have sold more books, but it just wasn't where I was going to go in personal and private life. And this was a real deliberation for me. I will say that my book, Michael Jordan, The Life, I just got notice it's been translated into the 21st language, Portuguese. It's all over the world. And that has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the presence and specter of Michael Jordan. Well, he made everybody around the world care about dowdy old American pro basketball.
And it just speaks to how selfless you are for him as the main focus of Michael Jordan life. And although you're the writer, obviously you're chronicling his life, the greatest basketball player of all time, and that your selfless approach, that you are blessed to have written this book, and where the emphasis of focus is, because it's about him, but you should take just as much credit because you're the one who had to write it, and it was exceptionally well written, and I'm continuing to read, and I can't wait to complete the book.
Thank you, Garrett. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Roland. Can't wait to talk to you soon. Happy New Year to you, and God bless, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Garrett. Take care, man.
Thank you. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.